Hello, everyone. My name is Eileen Contreras, and I am LogRhythm's digital marketing specialist. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Why Zero Trust Security Matters Now. With us are Andrew Hollister, LogRhythm's Chief Information Security Officer, and Zach Rowland, LogRhythm Principal Security Operation Analyst. I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items before handing things over to today's speakers. There are a couple of things for you to keep in mind throughout the broadcast. First, everyone is muted to ensure audio quality. With that said, all questions will be answered via email at the end of the webinar. So if there's anything you'd like to ask our panelists related to today's topic, please feel free to send questions through the chat feature for us to capture your emails. I'd also like to direct your attention to the attachment section of this broadcast. We've included free resources for you to download. Our agenda today is pretty straightforward. Our speakers are going to go over the importance of adopting a zero trust strategy and best practices to ensure success. Andrew and Zach will then highlight the pros and cons of implementing zero trust, what changes are needed to implement your strategy, and key obstacles to avoid. With that, I'll pass it over to our speakers. Andrew and Zach, over to you.
Welcome to our webinar, Why Zero Trust Security Matters Now. Zero Trust is actually considered by some as just a fad, and by others as the new silver bullet for cybersecurity. And today we want to discuss why we believe Zero Trust matters now, as well as share some of our experience in implementing Zero Trust in practice. My name's Andrew Hollister. I'm the CISO at LogRhythm, and in addition to overseeing internal and product security, I oversee the LogRhythm Labs team to research threats and deliver security, compliance, and operational risk content into our platform. I've got more than 20 years of experience in IT security, and I'm very pleased to be speaking to you all today.
Yeah, hi, my name's Zach Rowland. I'm the Principal Security Operations Analyst here at LogRhythm in the Office of the CISO. I've been with LogRhythm for about 9 years now, and in my current role, I keep and maintain all of our SOC systems, and I'm also the primary analyst for our own internal security.
Great. So let's get right into this now then. So I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I do want to go through some definitions of zero trust so that we're really all starting with a common starting point. And really beginning with David Holmes of Forrester. Forrester are regarded by many as the kind of initiators of modern day zero trust. And they describe it as an information security model that denies access to applications and data by default. And that threat prevention is achieved by only granting access to networks and workloads that uses policy informed by continuous contextual risk-based verification, both across users and their associated devices. The Lincoln Laboratory have done a significant amount of research in recent times around zero trust, and they describe it as a set of security principles that treat every component, service, and user of a system as continuously exposed to and potentially compromised by a malicious adversary. And finally, the NSA describe it as a security model, a set of system design principles, and a coordinated cybersecurity and system management strategy based on this acknowledgement that threats exist both inside and outside of traditional network boundaries. And I guess kind of in summary of all that, zero trust is really trying to recognize that there is no single factor of trust, and that access to applications and access to data should always be based on the evaluation of multiple characteristics of that access request. And in addition to that, it also really firmly rejects this idea that any network is considered to be trusted. It treats all networks as if they were potentially compromised. So I guess ultimately zero trust really sits on these three pillars of understanding. That is that all entities are untrusted by default, so that we assume that a breach is inevitable or perhaps has already taken place. The second pillar being that least privilege access is enforced. And by that, we mean we verify identity each time that a new resource is accessed. And finally, that comprehensive security monitoring is implemented. And that's to say, every action that is taken is logged and it's available for analysis. And again, kind of back to Forrester and David Holmes, the broad theme here is really the reduction of implicit trust. So with that as kind of a basis for our conversation, let's really get to the core question here. Why zero trust now? And really, as is on the slide here, it is all about addressing the most likely routes to compromise. And I'd like to kind of highlight some of the drivers around why this is now, and I'm really starting off with the Verizon data breach investigation report of 2022. And I've been a fan of this report. I've read it for many years myself. And according to this year's report, around 70% of breaches can be attributed to either credential theft or phishing. And actually, the very first data breach investigation report, way back in 2008, 2009, noted that many intrusions exploit the basic management or perhaps mismanagement of identity. And I think that the point here being is that whilst we do see 0 days and other kinds of vulnerabilities being exploited to gain access, the vast majority of attacks do involve the human element. And in fact, 82% of attacks, according to the report. I think the second driver here is really around central government. And central government really has woken up to the need for more action, and not least following the Colonial Pipeline incident, following SolarWinds, following the compromise of many healthcare organisations. And we've seen this executive order in 2021 directly calling out zero trust. And subsequently, we've seen guidance from the OMB, from NSA, more documentation from NIST, and so on. And this is really driving change in federal environments. And inevitably, that's going to flow out to federal suppliers, and the private sector is very likely to follow suit. And I think the third part here is really an enormous interest in zero trust in the aftermath of the pandemic. And computing prior to the pandemic even had to a great extent already moved to the cloud, and a lot of data had moved to the cloud, and now, kind of perhaps to put it in this way, that the people had moved to the cloud as well. That's to say, they were no longer on-prem in a quote unquote secured office environment. They were at home, perhaps at their kitchen table, or now in the post-pandemic time, maybe flitting between, sometimes at home, sometimes on the road, sometimes back in the office. So those kind of traditional cybersecurity models suddenly became irrelevant, and the interest around zero trust approaches really rocketed during the pandemic. And here we are in the post-pandemic world. It's even more relevant as that attack surface has continued to broaden. And just touching back on this subject of kind of 0 day versus operational type security, it really is your operational security, your identity and so on, that is much more likely to be the thing that catches you out. from an attacker's perspective, why would you spend the time and effort developing a 0-day if you can steal credentials and thus move freely around within an organization? And this is really the thing that Zero Trust is focusing on. Let's address those most likely routes to compromise. In any case, whatever the starting point, a compromise sooner or later is going to be leveraging identity and privilege. And ultimately, that makes it visible to monitoring. So as I've kind of researched this area, it's actually quite interesting to find out it's not actually terrifically new, many of the things we're talking about here. When you think about the approaches that are required to implement Zero Trust, least privilege, network segmentation, and so on and so forth, these really aren't new concepts in and of themselves, but it's the way that these concepts are put together and used to drive strategy that really gives Zero Trust its unique approach. And in terms of Zero Trust itself, I thought it was more something that had come around 2010 or so, but the term itself was actually first coined in a 1994 doctoral thesis on cybersecurity. And you can actually trace that thread back as far as 1975 with the least privileged ideas. Google famously started on a new model for network security in 2009 after the Operation Aurora attack, which they experienced. And that actually took them until 2016 to fully implement a full Zero Trust model. And that was a massive undertaking. And probably a lot of the reason for that was because much of the technology didn't exist. They had to build that from scratch by then. And if we then fast forward to 2022, then we've got a executive order from the Office of the President mandating Zero Trust for federal agencies. And we've really kind of gone almost full circle from those very early mentions of it back in 1994 and back to 1975. So in terms of Zero Trust itself, I guess one of the big misunderstandings around Zero Trust is really this, that it's a product or a product set, something you can buy off the shelf. And if that was the case, you let's go off and implement some products and be done with it. Whereas in reality, Zero Trust is really a model for thinking about cybersecurity. It's a set of cybersecurity principles, as we spoke about at the beginning here, which guides your cybersecurity design. It's not an outcome in and of itself. And I think when we're going on the Zero Trust journey, there's really two key questions. Question one, what is it that you're trying to protect? And Zach's going to come back more to this subject later as well. And question two, who should have access to whatever it is that you're trying to protect and under what circumstances? And if you know what it is you're trying to protect and you know who should have access to it, then you actually have a very good basis for choosing the right tools. And in fact, you may already have the right tooling in place. Zero Trust may well imply a reduction in tooling rather than an addition of tooling in your environment. So what about LogRhythm and Zero Trust? And I've got to say, we really are proponents of this approach. And as an organization, we've both written and presented extensively over the past 4 years or so. And we ourselves have adopted Zero Trust as our own overarching cybersecurity strategy. Now, that said, we don't label our solutions Zero Trust. And I think you should regard any vendor claims of that with some level of suspicion. we've talked about zero trust, we've created and freely shared materials around it, and indeed implemented the approach ourselves because we believe it's the right approach to cybersecurity in the modern world. And whilst it's not a silver bullet, I do believe it offers the most credible approach to solving the issues we see every day in cybersecurity, i.e., particularly those around identity and other types of operational security issues. Now, having said that we don't offer a kind of quotes zero trust solution, one of the pillars of zero trust is, of course, comprehensive security monitoring. And that's really where our platform plays in this space. It's really all around arming teams with high quality signals and automated responses. This is exactly what a zero trust approach requires in order to deliver those right outcomes, cut through the noise and act on those things which directly impact the security of your environment. So I mentioned the materials we've created on our journey. And in fact, when we started out on this journey, there was very little available in terms of guidance and templates and so on. So we actually had to create those materials for ourselves from scratch. And we've made those materials available from our website. And you can see the link on the slide here. So that's a little bit of a run through, a little bit of a basis and background to zero trust and some of our perspective on it. I'd like to hand over to my colleague Zach now to talk a little bit about our zero trust journey so far. Zach, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Andrew. So yeah, just as a little background here, I've been working within our SOC and within the office of the CISO here at LogRhythm since we started our journey on adopting zero trust internally. So one way or another, I've been a part of most of our major moves and initiatives. So first, I was going to kind of talk back through how we got to where we are today, and then kind of go into some of our lessons learned, helpful pieces of hindsight, and just sort of general information that can help an organization begin this undertaking that can seem quite daunting. All right, so next slide, please. So yeah, if to kind of take us back through our own journey of adoption, I'll talk about these all of the main pillars that we see here, starting off with monitoring. Monitoring, as one can imagine, we were pretty well positioned for from the get-go. We use our own SIEM, we use Network Monitor and MISNet. NDR. So monitoring is kind of our bread and butter. So we really had this piece down going back far before we decided to adopt zero trust. But kind of moving on from there, when we talk about the identity piece, our big sort of shift and change here came with adopting Okta as our sort of single source of truth for identity in combination with our HR software. And then moving on from that, kind of wrapping as many things as possible under that umbrella so that everything is playing on the same playing field in terms of identity. This was a really, really big move for us and required a lot of work, but the return on investment for it has been huge. And it's sort of one of these foundational items that the rest of the architecture depends on, is this sort of idea of common identity and understanding of identity. And I should also point out, when I do mention specific product names here, none of these are necessarily endorsements or condemnations. Really just kind of trying to tell you what we use internally and kind of how it fits into the big picture. So yeah, kind of moving on from that, looking at data and flows. This is an interesting area because data classification and classification of our flows and network architecture, This is a massive undertaking. And as Andrew talked about before, there really isn't an end state to most of these items, but in particular, data and flows. This is definitely an area where we made mistakes when we initially approached the problem. We basically tried to boil the ocean, and we talked to every department in the company and asked them about every single piece of data that they use, and we tried to classify it all. And really, if you're trying to do everything, you're not really going to succeed at doing anything. So we kind of changed the way that we approached that later on, which I'll get back into. But yeah, that was a very, very big exercise for us. And so moving on to that, device management. This is an area where we also undertook a big shift in the last year in terms of how we manage our devices. So we've adopted Intune and Conji as our primary device management platforms. And they sync back in with Okta and our HR software, so that really these days, bringing on a new employee is a very, very streamlined process for us. Getting them a laptop, making sure that that laptop in their account can access the right items and only the right items. It's much more slipstream than it used to be prior to adopting what we have today. Then moving on to that, we have one of our biggest pain points, which is the network piece. Removal of our classic VPN. Prior to adopting or undertaking the adoption of Zero Trust, we were using Pulse Secure for our VPN, which is sort of a classic VPN. It was a great product, but it really didn't work for us in terms of what we needed to do for our Zero Trust architecture. So we moved away from that, and now we use Zscaler. It's not actually a VPN, but it provides the functionality of one. And so we use that actually both in a firewall capacity and also as the sort of access control for network segments and assets. But yeah, this was a really, really big pain point for us, is removing, the day that we switched off the VPN. And I'll get into more about that a little bit later. But yeah, lastly is the improvement piece. And this really kind of the key point here is that this whole process is not a linear journey. It really is a cycle that we revisit on, sometimes a daily basis, refining, going back through these items for new initiatives or whatever it is. And then also really trying to build out integrations and automations in order to streamline the way that this whole process works, not just for end users, but for administrators as well. And next slide, please. So yeah, so now that we've kind of looked at where we are and kind of how we got here, the big question, how do you start if you want to adopt Zero Trust? Most of us don't have the luxury of adopting a new architecture like Zero Trust in a brand new company. If you were building a company out from scratch, it would probably be pretty easy to build it up from the get-go around the idea of Zero Trust. But, very few of us have that luxury. And from the beginning, Zero Trust in particular can feel very daunting. The idea of deny access by default and microsegmentation, IT people, security people alike, just, slap their head and say, oh my gosh, think of the tickets that are going to come in during this potentially multi-year process. Where do we even start on all of this? And next slide, please. And so that question kind of brings me to another question, which is sort of both a question and answer, and in a way, kind of my mantra that I have carried through our Zero Trust journey. And this is the question of, what are we trying to protect? Seems like a very common sense question, but really asking this question continually can really help sort of focus in and distill down on what do we need to look at first when we're looking at making a transition to a new architecture. What do we need to spend 90% of our time on, and what can we maybe leave for later? So for us, this question kind of came down to, what are our business critical assets? What's our business critical data? For us, this really boils down to customer data, critical infrastructure, privileged users and accounts, our code repositories, our CRM, customer database, and then some of our assets in the cloud. Really everything else other than those items that I just mentioned, the importance level is significantly lower. If I focus on just those items that I mentioned and, throw a wall around them and bring them into the fold in this architecture, we're really getting our security most of the way there. You may think it funny that I put, regular user workstations and laptops, as less important, or maybe even more shocking than that, non-privileged users, putting that way down at the bottom, in the standard asset listing. But really, these days, a non-privileged user in our environment can't really access a whole lot that can harm the company. So really, bottom line, this question sounds like common sense, but it's really easy to lose sight of. And if you ask this question often, it'll really help you kind of drill in on what to focus on when you start this journey. And next slide, please. So yeah, to kind of move on, talk about a few of our specific pain points and things that we've learned. Wanted to talk about asset management and access. Like most companies, we have a very diverse group of assets that are managed by different teams and departments. We have laptops managed by IT. We have cloud assets that are managed by developers. And, it's not always easy to understand, who even manages something and/or who needs access to what resource. And that question gets even more confusing when you talk about kind of traditional corporate assets versus development assets, and how we're really seeing kind of a blurring of the line, particularly when you talk about, DevOps, DevSecOps, things like that. And then of course we have the end user question of, hey, we're doing this new architecture. Is this going to save us any time, or is this just going to be a big headache? And next slide, please. So yeah, our big takeaways through our journey in this area, biggest one is probably taking the time to really understand what our environment is comprised of and where those items fall on our sort of criticality, what are we trying to protect question. Obviously you could spend years and years trying to document and understand every single thing that you have in the company. But if you view it through that lens of, okay, what do we have in the company that's business critical? It moves that whole exercise along a lot more quickly. Along with that, really emphasizing cross-team collaboration and buy-in. Anytime you're talking about a big shift like this, there's a large political element. And if everyone is not kind of pulling in the same direction, it's really hard to make those cross-team collaborations work well. And so kind of to tack onto that, the biggest relationship of the highest importance that we've noticed is the relationship that we've built between our security teams, our IT teams, and developers. That's where most of our work is done when it comes to zero trust. And next slide, please. So then, yeah, moving on from that, I mentioned this earlier, data classification. Boy, oh boy, what a daunting exercise this is. How do we classify 40 terabytes of data on our legacy file share? We tried to do that in the beginning, which we figured out was very, very time consuming, hard to do. And most of that data did not fall in the category of what we would consider business critical. Some of it did, but most of it did not. So really the time and energy spent there was really not a good use of our time. And it can feel very kind of contradictory, this idea that we need to have both a very wide and very deep understanding of all of our data. How the heck do we even start with that? And next slide, please. So yeah, I think our keys to success on this one, learned the hard way in some cases, was start with a high-level classification exercise, but keep it centered around business critical assets. I know I'm a broken record with saying this, but really putting a fence around that exercise is really what keeps things moving along and lets you center in on what you need to focus on. Along with that, the other biggest lesson that we learned is starting classification and analysis on data and flows for new initiatives immediately when that new initiative is being planned, even if that means working on it in parallel with older items. It can sometimes seem like a bad idea to maybe split your attention in this manner, but with Zero Trust, it really is a pinch of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Anything that you can front load in terms of planning new initiatives around an architecture like this, it will save you so much time in the long run. And next slide, please. Yeah, so Andrew touched on this one a bit as well. The idea that, especially these days, Zero Trust is thrown around a lot, in a marketing term sense. It's a Zero Trust product, or, our product is Zero Trust. It's, do we need to throw away all of our old products and buy new Zero Trust products? What do we do with our legacy systems? How does this fit in with our budget? Do we really need to buy another product in order to move to this architecture? And next slide, please. So yeah, I mean, the big picture answer is, no, you don't necessarily need to buy a new product to move to this architecture. There really is not an out-of-the-box solution for adopting an architecture. It's just so easy to confuse it as just a stamp that gets put on something and not, the sort of wide-reaching idea and architecture that it is. So I think it's very worthwhile keeping a critical eye towards claims around Zero Trust and products. But with that being said, a big picture view of your organization's architecture is essential. Requirements driving tooling and not the other way around is a big subcomponent of that. Which of course, you're stuck with what you're stuck with in terms of legacy systems. But when you're deciding whether to keep something or get rid of it, it really has to be thought about holistically in terms of the entire organization's architecture when you make that decision. And so for us, we're kind of constantly assessing and reassessing our rate of return when it comes to adopting a new platform or getting rid of an old one. We try to take it one piece at a time, but also keep an eye on the overall architecture. And then along with that, timing these things when a contract is up, if we do think that we need to get a different product. And next slide. Yeah, so I guess leads to kind of our final piece here is, what's next in our own journey at LogRhythm when it comes to Zero Trust. Automation is the big piece that we're kind of focusing on right now. Basically constructing workflows that make the entire work experience, both for end users and admins, as seamless as possible. Automation is really the key in a lot of the different pillars of Zero Trust to making this all work well and making it actually save you time and improve your security at the same time. Along with that, as I mentioned earlier, we're continuously evaluating and re-evaluating all these different pillars that I've already talked about. And, something that worked for us a year ago may not work for us today. And we try to always keep a critical eye as to what we can be doing better. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Zach. That was really interesting and insightful on our own internal Zero Trust journey. Just to wrap up, I just wanted to share a few closing thoughts here and just underline some of the points we've made throughout the presentation. And really starting off with this, you don't have to implement Zero Trust all at once. And certainly our experience and what we've seen around in the industry, there can in fact be benefits to implementing it piecemeal, as Zach just mentioned as well, both in terms of budgets, resources, and also broader disruption to the organization. It's also very important to ensure organizational and cultural alignment with the new approaches as you implement it, not underestimating the significance, for example, of getting IT on board with your zero trust project. This can have very significant benefits to IT, reduction in tickets and so on and so forth. But also consider this, if multiple systems are compromised, the level of effort that implies from IT is significant. And a zero trust approach can therefore provide significant savings, i.e. in not having to assess, diagnose, potentially rebuild and restore many endpoints. And finally, consider the operational efficiency gains that go along with this. And, just to give an example of this, we actually decreased our own IT workload for changes related to users by 60%, simply by adopting our HR management system as a single source of truth, and then automating the provisioning and deprovisioning of users. So I hope you found that interesting, and you've gained some useful takeaways for your own zero trust projects. Thanks very much for listening today, and we'll thank you.
Thanks again to everyone for joining today's webinar. We hope it was valuable, and if you think of any questions that you'd like to chat with us about later in your day, feel free to email us at info@logrhythm.com. As a final reminder, make sure to check out the attachment section of this page for some extra resources. They'll remain available even once we bring this live webcast to a close. Also, please do follow us on social media to keep on top of upcoming events and announcements. Our social media links are on this screen. Thanks again, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.